The planet has now entered what is called by scientists and others the rim of fire. The rim of fire can be located as starting in the South Island of New Zealand, going up through Indonesia, through Japan, to Alaska, coming down to California, and going down to Chile. And it touches a few other areas, but this is it. It's primarily the Pacific Basin, which is a rim of fire. And no nuclear explosion organized by man could ever even approximate the power of this rim of fire. The sun has recently gone into a new phase, a kind of phase it's gone into repeatedly in times past. A period of extreme violence, which used to come with an 11-year cycle, is now apparently coming with a 13-year cycle. What happened in Japan is simply a part of an ongoing process which is generated by nothing but the sun itself, the effect of the sun. Now, in order to deal with this crisis, which having hit the South Island of New Zealand, coming to Japan, headed in the direction of Alaska, headed in the direction of California, and down again toward Chile. This thing is something we're going to have to learn how to deal with. It's not a nuclear explosion. Nuclear explosions have nothing to do with this. It's a rim of fire, well known to all specialists in this area, on this subject. Now, what we can do about this will be presented to you in some detail in the following part of this report, which indicates to you what some of the problems are that we have to understand. Problems about what does the sun have to do with this? How do we know this? What do we know about it? What don't we know about it? What are we going to do about it? This indicates that we're going through a period, probably through this year into the year 2013, which will probably be a period of greatest risk for various parts, especially parts of the rim of the Pacific, the rim of fire. And so the report that's about to be given to you now, following my remarks here, will make the matter clear to you.
On the same day of the earthquake, there were auroras, the northern lights. People reported from Canada down as far south as Madison, Wisconsin, reported seeing these brilliant light shows in the nighttime skies. Now, was this just a coincidence that this occurred on the same day as the earthquake, or is there some type of correlation scientifically?
Well, it's very interesting. It was a phenomenal display of the aurora borealis. But to say that the earthquake caused the aurora, or that the aurora caused the earthquake, would be a mischaracterization. The aurora itself was apparently generated by what's called a coronal mass ejection from the sun, which impacted the Earth's magnetic field on Thursday afternoon. The coronal mass ejection was generated by a series of solar flares that occurred earlier in the week, Monday through Wednesday, which occurred in the context of the sun increasing in its solar activity after a several-year hiatus period. Now, the issue is that, yeah, the auroras were generated by the radiation from the sun. But if we look back at the past several earthquakes, you do see a correlation between solar activity and tectonic activity. For example, the recent earthquake that happened in New Zealand on February 22nd happened a little over a week after this whopper of a solar flare, which was the largest solar flare in 4 years. The Haiti earthquake, which happened last January 2010, occurred 2 or 3 days before a series of very powerful solar flares. So it's interesting that the coincidence and timing of the solar activity is so close in time with the tectonic activity, but you can't say that there's a causal relationship between them. So the question is, what is the relationship?
Just to clarify, what is the, has there been a change recently in these types of activities of the sun? I mean, you're saying that the aurora indicates some type of heightened activity on the sun. Is this, how frequent of an occurrence is this? Is this something that happens all the time, or has there been an increase?
Yeah, we're coming right out of the solar minimum, which is typically an 11-year cycle. That every 11 years it goes through a minimum and then a maximum. This particular cycle has been about 13 years, which has some interesting implications in terms of global climate. But usually it's an 11-year cycle. So you could look back and say, well, is there a correlation between increases of solar activity and increases of tectonic activity, such as the earthquakes, but also volcanism?
What is that cycle actually? What do you mean by the solar cycle itself?
Within the 11-year cycle, you see a decrease in the number of sunspots on the surface of the sun. And Herschel, back in the 1800s, recognized this, that the sunspots become more and more dense and then dwindle to nothing, and then get more and more dense and dwindle to nothing on a cycle of 11 years. It's actually a 22-year-long cycle, but it appears as an 11-year cycle because it goes from one pole to the other. But this is, when you have more sunspots, this represents the fact that the magnetic field of the sun, which is also known as the interplanetary magnetic field, because this thing goes all the way out past Jupiter and Saturn. These are periods that the magnetic field of the sun gets much more intense and much more active, which is what's represented by these, by the sunspots. And the solar flares actually follow the path of the magnetic field off the sun. So these are periods of higher heightened magnetic phenomena on the sun.
Could you say something about the relationship between the sun and the earth? What is actually going on in that space? Because I think most people just have the concept of the sun providing warmth, providing light to the earth, but don't have much of an idea of what is that space between the earth and the sun.
Yeah, the big problem is that people consider that the solar system as a whole is really just, 9 objects floating around in empty space plus this big sun, and we're kind of defending ourselves in this little corner of the solar system all by our lonesome. When in fact, if you go back to the works of Kepler, even he recognized this, that we're dealing with a unified whole system, that there are not individual separate objects in the solar system, but that there's a solar system, and the activity of that system is as a whole system. So in that sense, you have to be interested and intrigued by the correlation between the increased solar activity and then the increased geophysical activity. Because if you look right now, you had the earthquakes in the past 2 years, which are some giant earthquakes and had various effects. At the same time, just recently, within the past week, we've had explosions of many of the volcanoes around the so-called Ring of Fire, the Pacific Ocean rim. So you have an increase in geophysical activity at the same time that you have an increase of solar activity. It'd be a fallacy to say that the sun, that these solar flares are like shooting at the Earth and creating these explosions on the Earth. It would be more accurate to say, and this is something that we have to follow up on in terms of actual experiments and investigation, it becomes more clear that the solar system as a whole is right now going into a more active period, which is represented by these outbursts from at least 2 known bodies in the solar system. And I would say that we should look for more outbursts like this.
Yeah, I think that the tendency would be to say, well, are the flares causing the earthquakes, or are the earthquakes causing the flares, when that's really not the right question, because you're looking at a highly dynamic system from what you're describing. Mm-hmm. And there's potentially a higher cause, but it seems like we're seeing some type of correlation between the two. So then how how do we approach figuring out what is that higher cause?
Well, the first thing is to look at what happens on the Earth. You have to be a little bit more broad than looking at earthquakes and volcanoes as just pieces of rock moving around on the Earth. That is just static things that are, periodically shifting and moving. You have to look at in the domain of what we call cosmic radiation. So, for example, around earthquakes, there's a phenomenon of eyewitness accounts of various kinds of strange lights that happen around the epicenters of earthquakes. Many people have described seeing strange lights. For example, in the Chilean earthquake back in 2008, there was a show of lights around the area in Chile where you had the earthquake, and some people claim to have actually filmed it.
You're saying they see lights during the earthquake? Or?
Almost like there's lightning or something like that in the distance. And some investigators have actually surveyed people around the world who have been near earthquakes to make clear that these people aren't just seeing things, but this is a widespread phenomenon. Earthquake lights. Something that's also reported very often are strange, erratic behavior of animals, like dogs and cats, for example. They have a legendary ability to forecast an earthquake before it happens. Snakes will take off from the area. Rats will flee an area. Other phenomena like strange weather patterns right before an earthquake. These are all eyewitness accounts, and we've been having these eyewitness accounts going back for hundreds of years. Now, there have been attempts to explain this stuff. The usual attempt is that people are just crazy, which is not true. But other attempts have been to say, well, maybe there is some kind of electromagnetic phenomena happening that the animals can sense and that people can see sometimes.
It's not just a mass hallucination in different parts of the planet at different times.
Right, like right now there's a mass hallucination that there's no such thing as a British Empire, right? But no, it's not a mass hallucination. There is some kind of a real effect going on. So the question is it an electromagnetic effect? Because then you would have a connection between the sun and the earth through the fact that we are living in a cosmic radiative environment. So some of the other effects that have been recognized is, for example, there are magnetometers near the time of an earthquake, before the earthquake, can register long-wave, strong changes in the geomagnetic field. These are called very long frequency or ultra-long frequency oscillations, which are very high amplitude. They're very strong oscillations, but it's about 5 to 10 cycles per second changes in the geomagnetic field. And for example, the whopper that hit Alaska in 1964, which was magnitude 9.2.
Are you talking about a cycle of a change in the magnetic field, or anomalies and irregularities from what is known as the regular shape of the magnetic field? Well,
the geomagnetic field already has secular variations, which are determined by some phenomena inside the Earth, but also determined by activity of the sun, for example. Our magnetic field is very closely connected with the interplanetary magnetic field. But what these guys are measuring, for example, this 1964 Alaska earthquake, there was a magnetometer which happened to be very nearby and also at a high level so that it wasn't damaged in the earthquake, measured, it was between 5 and 10 hertz cycle of change of intensity and direction of the earthquake, or of the geomagnetic field, about 2 hours before the earthquake actually hit.
So an actual change in the Earth's magnetic field preceded the earthquake?
The magnetic field of the Earth, the local magnetic field of the Earth, changes in response to an earthquake before the earthquake actually happened. The idea that a magnetic field is going to shift the rocks on the Earth is kind of a strange idea, but the fact is that the rocks do shift coincident with some kind of a discharge of electromagnetic radiation, which changes the magnetic field. It can be picked up by weather satellites as increased infrared radiation before and after the earthquake. It can also be picked up by some of these global positioning satellites, which have to essentially shoot signals back and forth through the ionosphere, which is a charged layer of the atmosphere. And they pick up that days before, up to 6 days before an earthquake, you have a change in the ionosphere above the area that the earthquake is going to hit. And then that change diminishes after the earthquake over a period of several days. So you do have a coincidence of electromagnetic phenomena and tectonic phenomena. So the cause is not clear yet. That's one of the questions that we need to look towards answering. But the relationship is definitely there.
Now, in recent videos, some members of the basement team have been discussing the 62 million year cycle of the solar system through the galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
And the different effects that this has for us on Earth, changes in influx of cosmic radiation, in biodiversity, etc. Does this come into our equation here?
We're going to be releasing some more material on this over the coming days as we investigate it. But yes, there is some clear relationship. You have the 60 to 62 million year cycle of biodiversity, which you mentioned. Some of the researchers who identified the 62 million year cycle threw open a net to say, okay, what other cycles on the Earth do we know of that follow a roughly 60 to 62 million year cycle? One of them was the tectonic changes on the Earth. And we've seen that in the great so-called mass extinctions, like the extinction of the dinosaurs or the Permian-Triassic extinction, that those extinctions are associated with increased volcanism and other increased tectonic activity. In fact, the Permian-Triassic extinction is actually, which was like the big mother of all extinctions, like 98% of the species went extinct, is today blamed predominantly on an explosion of volcanism on the surface of the Earth. So there is a 62 million year cycle of this tectonic activity. Now, what we're interested in is the fact that the anti-entropic development of life on the Earth, which goes through these so-called mass extinctions in the form of transformation of the organisms into higher and higher types of organisms, and a transformation of the whole biosphere in these shifts, that must be due to a change in the cosmic radiation environment of the whole solar system. So therefore, a current link that, were we to be able to find a link between increased cosmic radiation in the form of the sun's activity and increase in tectonic activity on the Earth, then we have an experimental domain to work with, while observing the fact that you have increase of tectonic activity and rapid transformations of organisms, periods of transformation of organisms on the Earth, which is periodic. And the other interesting thing is that the 62 million year cycle is not a solar system cycle, but it's actually a cycle of our travel through the galaxy. So this is a galactic transformation period.
Well, it really seems like, well, there's a lot of implications for what you've just gone through. A lot of what we witness on Earth every day is the result of a higher process, but then also it seems that there's a real coherence between these developmental processes, the development of organisms, and in these tectonic shifts that are an effect of a higher process. I'd like to ask you what we should do with this. I mean, where do we go from here? What do we need, given the current economic and political situation that we're in? Where do we go with this?
Well, over the next couple of days, we're going to be pulling together a more detailed picture of the implications. But for now, it's pretty clear that step one, besides dealing with the immediate damage of in Japan and the surrounding areas due to the earthquake and then the gigantic tsunami, we need to get rid of President Obama. That would be the best first step. and then we could put through the Glass-Steagall and the other types of economic changes, so that we can start putting back together our human spaceflight program. We need to do things like NWAPA and rebuild the system of human control over the biosphere. But along with that, we need to, again, rev up our acceleration of human beings into space. Because, for example, we need to see what types of seismic activity happens on the moon. We need to see what kinds of seismic activity happens on Mars. We don't know. Perhaps Mars is having earthquakes right now, too, that are huge, that we can't measure.
Do we measure seismic activity on any other body besides the Earth?
Well, the Apollo astronauts put seismographs down onto the surface of the moon, but those were shut off pretty soon after the Apollo program was ended. So we used to, but now we're confined to the surface of the Earth. What we need to see, is this a solar system-wide phenomenon? And the only way we're going to do that is by getting out into space with people who can do the exploration and put the types of devices out there that we need.
Right, because if we're not measuring the possibility that this could be an effect on the level of the solar system, then it's going to be very difficult to determine that higher cause.
Exactly. If we stay on Earth, we're pretty much screwed. We got to bring people and cats and dogs to the moon and to Mars to see if they respond at the same time to heightened solar activity the way they do on the Earth.
We've come to a time that science must advance itself to the point that we understand better how to deal with some of the peculiarities of our galaxy. Because our solar system, of which the sun is the center, is merely a part of our galaxy, an integral part. The galaxy is not something distant from us. We are in the galaxy. We're on the rim of the galaxy. That's where the solar system is. And often in the past, like the extinction of whole species some time ago, entire species were wiped out and new species emerged of living species on this planet. It was caused by a temper tantrum of sorts, you might call it, by the galaxy. And these are the kinds of things we have to finally come to understand. How does our galaxy work? How does our solar system work? And what are we going to do about getting out there with space exploration by man to find out what really goes on the moon, to find out some of the other things that determine what is going to happen to us on Earth? We have to get out there and find out what it is. And exploring the solar system is one step, but understanding the galaxy is absolutely indispensable.
Last week, LPAC published a report concerning the solar and galactic implications of the Japanese earthquake. In that report, Lyndon LaRouche made a forecast in which he stated that we're going to continue to see major earthquakes along the Pacific Ring of Fire. So we have Peter Martinson here from the LPAC Basement Research Team to discuss other forecasts coming from the scientific community. Peter, what can you tell us about these recent forecasts of major tectonic activity along the Ring of Fire?
Well, right when we put out the video, there was an avalanche of other forecasts that were coming out about the same time. Some of them they're pretty obviously cranks, just responding to the fact that we've had an increased number of large earthquakes just recently. But a couple of them are pretty significant. I'm going to go through two of them just as exemplary. For example, the first one was just recently a scientist named Alexander Solovyev from the International Institute of Earthquake Prediction Theory and Mathematical Geophysics predicts or forecasts that very soon we could see a large earthquake on the Kamchatka Peninsula coming off of Russia, which if you look at the map, you'll see that that's headed around the Ring of Fire towards Alaska and the northern North America.
Yeah, it's right north of Japan, right?
It's just north of Japan. Now, he cites evidence, seismic evidence, that there are an increasing number of tremors that are getting more and more serious in the Kamchatka region. Now, we also know that that Kamchatka was the site of the explosion of 2 or 3 large volcanoes right around the time of the Japanese earthquake. So that place is heating up, and his forecast is rather credible. Now, the other one is in the United States, which is a man named Jim Birkeland, who's a former United States Geological Society geologist, forecast that this week, from about tonight, the 19th, through about the 26th of March, is a window of seismic opportunity for California. That California is due and threatened with a very large earthquake along the San Andreas Fault, which now his evidence is rather interesting. He cites 2 specific pieces of evidence. First, the relation of the moon and the sun relative to the Earth, which tonight is what's called the supermoon phenomenon, where it's come to its closest point near the Earth at the same time that it's a full moon, so at opposition to the sun. So the tidal changes in the Earth, he says, can have the potential of destabilizing the area around the earthquake. His other point of evidence, which is also very interesting, regards the strange behavior of animals. And he says, for example, very recently there have been a couple of so-called fish kills, where a large number of dead fish wash up on beaches in California and also Mexico very recently.
Now, on the moon, what is it that, how is it that the moon is affecting the Earth? Why would it be a hypothesis that the moon could actually have a tectonic effect on the Earth?
Well, the moon is related, anybody who lives on the coast knows this, that you have 2 high tides and 2 low tides every single day. So the water is going up and going down twice a day. And the going up and going down is always associated with the moon going overhead. So so the moon will go overhead, and you have a high tide which follows it. 12 hours after that, you'll have another high tide. Now, the full understanding of how that works is not yet understood, again. But when the moon is full, we tend to have larger tides. The tides go up further and they go down further. When the moon is at the closest point in its orbit, because it's an elliptical orbit, when it's at perigee, you also tend to have the largest tides of the month. Now, tonight, both of those events are occurring at the same time. Not only is the moon at its perigee, but it's also a full moon, so you have the opposition to the sun. So the sun is also affecting these tides. Now, the issue that people don't know that much about is that the tides don't just affect the water, but they also affect the crust of the Earth. That the crust also goes up and down, very small amounts, on the order of inches, every day, twice a day, along with the tides. So
the moon is creating a type of pulling effect on the Earth, not only affecting the water, but you're saying the land as well?
Apparently, yeah. There's a response by the land to the position of the moon, and it's more pronounced when you have this conjunction of an opposition between the moon and the sun and the closest point of the moon to the Earth. And so the theory of Birkeland is that when the crust is being deformed by those types of stresses, you have the potential of releasing an immense amount of tension that's been built up along a fault line, which is exactly the condition we have along the San Andreas Fault in California. Geologists across the world agree that that fault has been ready to go for decades. Now, the other aspect of his forecast regards these animal reactions, which are a little bit, they're pretty interesting. He cites a couple of recent so-called mass deaths of fish that have washed up on the shores around in Mexico and also Southern California. He also looks at, so mass deaths of fish. He says that his so-called forecasts of earthquakes also include beaching of whales, things like wild animals coming into town, flocks of birds that migrate strangely, all of which he attributes to the fact that near the time of an earthquake, which we talked about in the last show, near the time of an earthquake, you have anomalies in the geomagnetic field, and all of these animals use the magnetic field to migrate. Whales do. Fish, apparently, like tuna and salmon, have the ability to navigate according to the magnetic field. Birds, same thing.
This is the same phenomenon of magnetoreception that your research team discussed in the report that you recently put out on this website called the Extended Sensorium. One of the papers detailed this phenomenon in pigeons, which was the reason why homing pigeons were used in World War II in various wars, because of their ability to navigate their way home no matter where on the planet they were. How does, maybe you could elaborate on how that works and why?
Well, yeah, in the Sensorium report we go through, this is one of the reasons why we take these types of forecasts very seriously. So what we go through in the Sensorium report is that all the organisms on the planet, including plants to some extent, and including humans, are very sensitive to domains of cosmic radiation that are outside of the usual visual senses, the usual hearing senses, what we typically call the so-called five senses. And what we show in the report, the five senses are it's kind of a hoax to say that there are only five senses, that there are a lot more, like the magnetoreception. There are some indications that human beings respond to magnets, the magnetic field. There's very clear, obvious evidence that birds use the magnetic field to navigate. And the geomagnetic field on our scales is not a very strong force. It's not a very strong, like if anybody's used a magnetic compass, you see that it takes a while for the compass to settle down, and any electronic device that's near the compass is going to throw that thing out of whack. So the magnetic field is less strong than that. Yet these organisms, these birds, whales, fish, can sense direction relative to things like the magnetic field. And what we find is that the organisms are so sensitive to these, not just magnetic fields, but also ultraviolet radiation, infrared radiation, cosmic rays, all domains of cosmic radiation, organisms respond to, no matter how weak those fields are, going all the way down to like micro Teslas, tiny intensities. So we would expect that when you have a period near an earthquake which exhibits these long wave changes in the magnetic field, the geomagnetic field, that animals would respond to that, even though the changes are very, very slight. Now the other aspect that he points out, which is kind of funny, but it's also something that you would imagine you'd look for. We referenced before that dogs and cats can sometimes forecast earthquakes. Well, this gentleman in California watches the homeless animal shelters to look at how many more dogs and how many more cats come in at different times of the month. And apparently, just recently, there's been a spike around Southern California of stray dogs and cats who have, for some reason or other, freaked out and left their owners, possibly for survival.
So people should be assured that their pets aren't just leaving them for personal problems that they may have with their owners. Right.
They don't hate the owners. Don't panic. Your cats and dogs still love you. They're at the pound, but they just got a little freaked out about the fact that an earthquake might hit.
Oh, good
soon.
news. Your animals still love you, but you may have an earthquake.
Right, exactly. So follow your pets.
Now, there's various reports on the internet of people claiming to predict earthquakes. What is it about these two forecasts that you chose to refer to that make them particularly credible?
Well, the reason we're interested in the earthquake is that, and the series of earthquakes in general, is that they present a problem for humanity because we don't understand what the relationships are, but we know that there are the relationships, and these gentlemen do point at the specific types of relationships that that we would expect. Now, there's a pretty big block on the ability of scientists to forecast and publish their forecasts of earthquakes because people are afraid, well, it's going to panic people, you know, you're going to cause mass panic and it's going to be horrible. People are going to start to say you're crying wolf and they won't listen to you anymore. But science as a method of thinking is the ability to forecast future conditions in the universe, which includes being able to forecast at least windows that certain things are coincident, like earthquakes, solar activity, the moon, and things like that.
Well, it seems you would also need a relationship to the government so that the government can be able to prepare people.
Exactly.
As opposed to just having a lone scientist make a prediction, cause a panic, you would have a cooperation and have a public announcement and a procedure and preparation for these types of events.
Right. For example, it would make sense right now for the U.S. government to begin preparing for something like a gigantic earthquake in California, especially knowing all the conditions that are, you know, essentially lining up right now. The problem is that we have President Obama in office, and hopefully, you know, there are some reports that there's an increased internship in mental hospitals around the times of earthquakes. So this would probably be the perfect opportunity to invoke the 25th Amendment and put an insane Obama safely away as a victim of earthquake insanity.
Or he might just think it was the popular thing to do and
exactly
go along with it.
And everybody there will like him, so it's fine. We should do it. But the other aspect of this is that, yes, science is it is something that should be predictable. We don't understand what's causing the earthquakes. We don't understand what exactly the relationship is. But we do see very clear correlations. For example, just I think it was yesterday, there was another very large solar flare. The sun is going into a solar maximum period, and it'll be headed into that maximum. It's not at its most active point yet. It'll reach that, we think, in 2013. But even that's somewhat debatable because the sun just went through a cycle that was 2 years longer than every other solar cycle that we've seen before. So things are changing with the sun. But then we also have what we've referenced before in some other videos, a 62 million year cycle, give or take a couple million years, cycle of not just biodiversity, but also the motion of the solar system through the galaxy, which is also related to a 62 million year cycle of increased and decreased tectonic activity, which is represented by things like volcanism.
Would you say we're at some type of anomalous point within that cycle now?
We think so, but again, this requires a lot more investigation in exactly this area. For example, you know, we could say 65 million years ago was the great extinction of the dinosaurs. So 3 million years ago, we were at the other potential great extinction and transformation point. So we probably are at a very tumultuous point in the lifespan of our solar system, which also seems to coincide with the rise and domination of creative human beings, which brings another issue to play, which is that all the other organisms in the past have gone extinct. That's clear. Human beings are the only species on the planet in history that have the capability of preventing themselves from going extinct by understanding just these types of phenomena that these two gentlemen are referring to. We can creatively understand what would cause the destruction of human civilization and turn the tables on that, which we're right at a point where we need to do that.
Well, you could say that the human mind is the same type of weak force that you've been discussing in these phenomenon. The magnetic field is not such a particularly strong force, but animals can detect it. Mm-hmm. It causes very powerful effects, even though the force itself may not seem very strong. It seems that the human mind is a similar type of force. Mm-hmm. That while we're not physically the strongest, the biggest, the fastest, those with all of the super senses, we have quite the capability to move mountains and to change the face of the earth.
Right. Like for, you know, we have two examples. One is that we do have a mass strike which is breaking out right now, which, you know, we had various reports on the website, but with the mass strike, you have another example of a breakout of a cosmic radiation event, where it's not that some person in Libya or some person in Egypt, somehow got, a forceful message to somebody in Wisconsin to, begin the protests. But there was essentially a simultaneous breakout around the planet of this mass strike phenomenon.
It wasn't Twitter. There's something in the spirit of the times that is moving people.
Right, exactly. And then another example of this is our ability to make discoveries of how things like the biosphere function, and then craft the land and the biosphere in order to make it do things that we want it to do. For example, with the North American Water and Power Alliance project, where we have the plans, the know-how, we're contacting the engineers and so forth to begin putting into place the types of dams and reservoirs and digging out deep tunnels and things like that to bring the hundreds of millions of acre-feet of fresh water down into the dry parts of the United States, which, by the way, might have very important consequences in terms of seismic activity on the Earth. And I'll just say one thing that this Russian scientist says, Solovyev, he makes the point that we're seeing small tremors right now in Kamchatka. He says that could be leading up to one violent release of whatever the tension is that's been building up there, which would be a giant earthquake. Or it could continue these micro tremors to the point that things settle down and the tension gets dissipated over a long period of time. We know that when we set up large reservoirs of water, we create the conditions for increased seismic activities. You tend to have earthquakes around newly created deep reservoirs of water. Now, if we create giant reservoirs of water in places like Alaska or along the Rocky Mountain Trench, we're going to be putting water in areas that tend to be more seismically active. By doing things like adjusting the reservoirs, we might be able to let out some of the steam of some of these earthquakes and actually control the power of some of these earthquakes.
It seems that the NWAPA project itself would be a science driver for looking into this seismic activity.
Exactly. This is going to be a boon for all sciences that deal with not just the internal workings of the Earth, but the relation between the Earth and the rest of the solar system domain.